Games. And I'm going to introduce you to my co-host.
You shouldn't like your intro.
Apparently it wasn't very
It's
good.
like, oh, this.
That is my lovely co-host, Suzanne Sheldon. So, thank you. So today, I think we have a nice treat for you. We've got a lovely panel of guests, and I'll get them to introduce themselves and give you a little snippet about themselves as well. So, I'll start with you.
Hi, I'm John Brieger. I run Brieger Creative, which is a board game development firm based in Sunnyvale, 30 minutes south of here. We work with publishers to take games from prototype to product, so refining games to be the best they can be. And that covers things like playtesting, gameplay streamlining, product design, sometimes laying out pre-press files, sort of everything after the game is signed from the designer before it comes to market.
And before you go ahead, I should have asked this. Does anybody in here require us to remove our masks while we're speaking? Okay, thank you very much.
I'm Brian Henk, Pull the Pin Games. I've done a lot of indie game development, design development, publishing, formerly with Overworld Games, but we rebranded to Pull the Pin Games not too long ago. So Good Cop, Bad Cop is probably our most popular game that we made, but I've done a dozen Kickstarter campaigns, so I know how to. At least I've learned a lot of lessons about what not to do to bring a game to market. So hopefully you have some good questions and I can share some lessons learned.
Hi, I'm Monique. I do stuff online where I talk about things I love and then have people tell me about things I love, and I love that. And then in my regular job, I work for Elf Creek Games, and I am their customer experience manager. So if you send out an email, you're probably going to get me writing back to you.
Oh, right. Yes. Hello, everyone. My name's Yurko. I'm a reviewer and photographer for a website called What's Eric Playing. I do the right side of board game reviewing and photography. So on my end, I'm sort of your once you hit market or right before you hit market, how do you work with media, content creators, influencers, and other folks to make sure that your game is hitting the market in the right light, appealing to the right audience, and landing in such a way that people actually see your game, because thousands of games get released every year. How does your game find the right people who are going to be excited about playing it?
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much. The structure of today, I'll be asking some questions, they'll be giving their answers, and we will leave some time for all of you to ask some questions as well. Okay? Perfect. Wow, I've got a nice big one for all of you. What makes a good game? Generally, what makes a good game? Because I think we're going to get a lot of very different answers here. So who'd like to take that one first?
I can start.
Yeah, Eric, take that one.
I think about games a lot from in my day job. I work on education and education technology. So I think a lot about a good game for me is one that it enables the player to learn the mechanics of the game while they're playing. So you, as a player, you get to actually experience yourself becoming better at the game as you play it. And so you get the reward cycle of, I now know something that I didn't know before, or I learned a strategy that I didn't know before, or I can look at someone else playing better than me and be like, oh, that's how you play this game, or etc. So that's good for me. That's talking about a game as a mechanical and interpersonal experience. As a product, I tend to think of a game being good by some metrics like how are the components, how's the rule book, how does it all marry together. If you've got a term that I tend to use is ludonarrative dissonance. So if what the story your game is trying to tell doesn't match up well with the game's theme, or the mechanics aren't executed well through the theme, I as a player tend to feel a big disconnect there. And so that makes the gameplay experience feel less cohesive. This is sort of like, oh, I'm doing X, but the game rewards me for doing Y. Y is more fun, X is more strategic, so now I have this burden as a player of, I need to do the unfun thing to make points, so I can do the fun thing to enjoy the game. That's a gameplay experience I'd say is dissonant there. You can feel it as a player. But that's just a couple examples. This is what makes a good game.
I think it, is it a good game or is it a phenomenal game? Because now if it's a good game, it's pretty easy to make a good game, but you need to bring all of those things Eric said, plus a whole bunch of other things together to make it a phenomenal game that's really going to be successful in the market. You can't just make a good game anymore. It's not going to sell. So yeah, it's so many things. It's really challenging now. Every year it gets harder and harder to make one of those phenomenal games that's very successful ones.
Yeah.
I think, sorry.
Go ahead.
I think a good game has emotional social intelligence, because you're going to be playing this game, even if you're a solo gamer, you're going to be playing this game as a human being, not as a bot playing a game. So while no matter how clever or intelligent the design may be, if you are lacking kind of like that human interaction experience that really gets people to kind of get together and want to tackle something like the rules in order to complete the strategy, you really need to understand that these are people who are going to be interacting with each other. The way that you set up kind of the win conditions, the mechanics, and the whole journey of the game from beginning to end or victory really does have to keep in mind that humans will be interacting with each other, and what kind of interactions are you producing in that game that are going to bring out a positive experience even if there's a conflict in the game. So I think those are my favorites.
On my team, we talk a lot about what we call the promise of a game. The promise is sort of the title, the cover, and the 2-sentence description of the game. And for us, a lot of what makes games that I enjoy is that they have a really clear and compelling promise, and then they deliver on that promise. And that goes back to sort of like the dissonance that Eric was talking about. Sometimes you can feel a game will promise you one thing and deliver something else, and even if the thing that it delivers is a good thing, because there's the mismatch between sort of the promise and what you get, you have a worse experience. And so that's something I'm always thinking about, not just from a how does the game play perspective, but who is going to be interacting with that game, who's going to be playing that game. The promise starts way before they ever sit down at the table to play your game. And when we're thinking about how we're lining up games to go to market, we are thinking a ton about what is the promise we're making to players.
And that actually leads quite nicely to my next question. Actually, there's a
I
couple
didn't
things.
think,
No, it's great. There's a couple things I wanted to touch on there, but there's something exciting here for
What cheering you on?
You don't even know what it is yet.
But that's the promise of the question.
That's what you did there. So, what does your game have to say? Does this make sense what I'm asking? Sometimes you see a game, what is it telling me? What's the story behind it? Like, why do I need to play this game? Why do I need to own this game? Why does this game need to be on the shelf?
Can I contextual, at least can I
Please,
interpret the way that I'm
please.
thinking about your question?
And that's why I
Sorry,
phrased it like that, please.
I frame it similarly. I always say that like a game essentially needs to assert its right to exist
Right.
to a certain degree. Like, why did this game need to be made? And more importantly, why did this game need to be made now? Right? Like when we think about a game, there's a product release that's sort of Brieger's zone of things is like there's a moment in time where a game is going to come out, and that moment has a cultural impact, it has a market impact, and it also has sort of like a mechanical impact. Like Dominion being released in 2009, I want to say. I shouldn't have used this. Don't quote me on that. But okay,
There you go.
but that's very different because it had a very specific cultural impact, it had a very specific market impact, it had a very specific mechanical impact. If you were to release, say, Dominion, the game, same game, now, after we are sort of, now deck builders kind of need to be, oh, it's a deck builder and it's a racing game, or oh, it's a refinement of this mechanic. Now you've sort of missed that assertion, right? It's like, oh, well, it's good, like it's very good, and for many people, Dominion is their favorite game. I'm not here to knock Dominion, I love Dominion,
Sure.
but like, it's a very different market for your game, and being cognizant of those forces can help you find a better niche for it to fall into. There's the tension there is that means that some people will say, oh, in response to that, I need to over-complexify my game, or add something that makes it zing, or special, or gimmicky. But if it, like, your game needs to pass that test. It needs to assert that it needed to exist right now. And if it doesn't need to exist right now, that's fine. There's always something you can salvage from it, pull up something else, and that's cool. But releasing something that misses that zeitgeist just means that it's going to be another, to quote Brian, a good game in a sea of good games. Right?
Absolutely. No, great. Anybody else want to take a crack at that question?
I got so lost in the answer to the question. I was like, yes. What?
What does the game say?
Circuitous.
And I phrased it like that because I knew that everybody would probably have a different way of thinking about it. So I definitely see what you're talking about, like especially times now, how it's going to fit in the market right now. I don't know if that is something that comes up for any of you.
Yeah, I think that probably goes to does the artwork fit the promise? Does the game itself fit the promise? Does everything come together, graphic design, come together to say, that, whatever you're trying to say? And yeah, and I think you answered that really well. I think you pretty much nailed it, but the only thing I might add is just like if it doesn't, like you said, if it doesn't need to exist, like maybe while you're developing it, somebody comes out with one that does it better, what you were trying to do, you can put yours aside, go work on something else, because you don't need to release that anymore. Like that exists now, and so people are enjoying that game that someone else created, and you can find something else.
Oh yeah, one time I was trying to do a little bit of game design, and it turns out that a game that had just launched on Kickstarter was like loosely almost the exact game design that I had in my brain, and I was like, oh thank God, I don't have to do any of this work.
Yeah.
This guy already playtested it.
Yeah.
I just bought it. It's great.
So that actually leads me to another question, which is not on my list.
Just come off book.
But now does that mean that as someone designing games, do you need to be cognizant of other games that are visibly out there, possibly now maybe doing the same concept as you, or do you kind of compete and say, no, I think I can do that better?
I think it definitely depends on who you're talking to. Are you trying to talk to other board gamers? Because then it's fairly easy because you don't have to do a lot of the back explaining about it's okay, these mechanics are fun. Deck building means we get to get cards. But I think when it comes to what I think I would want to see and what draws me into different games is the perspective being told. Because there are a lot of war games, and I'm not going to yuck anybody's yum or anything like that. But I love more like Brew from Panelists as an example. These really cute anime-looking Pokemon-type creatures, but it's like an absolutely violent game, forest fires and magical creatures. But I love that it gets told through the artistic lens of the way that it does. Kind of like how Root did with those beautiful little creatures that are just terrifying each other. And I love that you don't have to follow kind of the same narrative and the same perspective. You can do a whole lot with mechanics if you just look at it from a different background, a different lens, a different view, and you're going to get that the more diverse the mindsets are and the brains are that are behind creating that game. So I love seeing unique stories and themes being told from a way that are just not existing in other games.
Yeah. I think, John, you've probably seen this before too, because I know I have the newer designer who has their game that they've created, and it's their first game or their second game or their third game. It's still you can tell that they haven't played enough games themselves, and they haven't learned enough about game design. I mean, sometimes maybe they will create something that nobody's ever seen before, and it's amazing because they're coming at it from thinking so far outside the box, because they haven't been exposed to those things. But usually, there's a lot of issues that they haven't discovered through other games or playtesting other people's games that they could apply to their own designs to make them better. So I think in that respect, the more games you play, the more familiar you are with the other games out there. And what they have delivered, the better your game will be.
I'm sort of a big believer that there's no here's the games you have to play to be a game designer or a critic or reviewer or whatever. There's so many games out there, and it is important to play games to be to experience games. So that you understand how games affect people that play them as a designer, as a publisher. But I don't think you have to have an exhaustive knowledge of every game that releases, and at this point, it's not possible to have exhaustive knowledge of every game that releases. So, yes, I think you want to be aware of things as a designer, but for me personally, it's okay to make things that are in a space other people are making things in, as long as I feel like what I'm making has something unique to say within that space. So Roll and Writes, I think, is a good example. 3-4 years ago, the genre of Roll and Writes, this is games in which you have some sort of random element and everyone is writing that based on that random element into a personal sheet, usually. There was a sort of upward trend in this game style, and there was an initial market reaction of, is this a fad, or is this going to burn itself out? And it turns out that designers and publishers came up with lots of really great new, unique ways to express things within that that sort of genre of game. And there was a period sort of right in the middle, I would say like end of 2018 and 2019, where a lot of publishers were saying like, oh, we don't want to see any more roll and writes. We don't think, we don't want to keep competing in the space. But I think now that we're, 3 years later, you can see it's still thriving, it's still selling, people are still doing great, there's still new innovative things coming out. So I'm usually not worried when there are other games that are similar to things that I'm working on, as long as I feel like I can identify the unique thing that this game has to say.
I will say, as a nightmare person, I would really love to start seeing something akin to how when movie studios release a movie, there's also another studio that will release a movie that's almost the same movie, like Armageddon and Deep Impact, or The Illusionist and Prestige. I would like that for games. I think that would be fun.
Yeah.
Not for any of y'all probably, but for me on the review side, I feel like these are the same.
And that sort of parallel evolution does happen because gamers are inspired by culture, right? Games don't exist in a vacuum. We exist where other kinds of media and movies and TV and video games exist. So, at the end of this year, beginning of next year, I expect we're going to see 5 to 10 Wordle-based games hitting the market.
Yeah, probably.
I'm here for this.
Dinosaur Island and Dinogenics came out within 3 months of each other. So this does happen, right? People are inspired by the same properties and the same concepts, the same ideas floating out within mechanics of games, and that sort of what they call it, parallel evolution happens, and they often don't know about each other, right?
And actually, did you want to go ahead and say?
I was gonna say to kind of grow on kind of what John brought up about innovation and games and things like that. I think it can be hard to introduce a lot of change, especially amongst a traditional embedded crowd when you have a fandom of something. When you love something, you don't want people to come in and change it too much because you're like, but I love this, it is mine. And so when Roll and Writes came out, I remember a lot of people going, is this really a game? And they're
The whole
anytime,
game activity.
yeah, the game activity argument I think is not the important part, but what can we do with this new idea, with this thing that we love? And I love seeing that so much. So for example, Floor Plan is another game I really liked, and this is you're building a house, but it's a roll and write. So as you're building a house, you also have to meet the needs of the people that you're building the house for. And then I like that because it takes me out of my perspective of how I would want a house. And now I get to think of someone who needs a house for accessibility reasons, or somebody who needs a house because they really like looking at water, or they really like looking at trees, things I would not consider in general. I love learning that kind of thing, and I wouldn't be able to really get that in a 45-minute game, that new perspective, that new understanding, that new way of thinking about others without something like a roll and write introducing that to me. And so I love the idea of these new mechanics coming out. I don't think they break the game, the industry, or anything else like that. Embracing those new ideas and changing mechanics is just chef's kiss.
Or someone who needs a house without any doors because you forgot to ask. No problem I've had. I was just like, oh, doors, that would have been smart.
Yeah, you take your floor plan and you just make it an RPG escape room.
So this brings me to a question about art, actually, because we touched on this a little bit. And as of late, we know there are some people who create games that have a cultural context or things like that to it, right? And you want to be culturally accurate. And that's definitely become something that's at the forefront, especially as of late. Some designers are kind of, hey, I did this art, this is the kind of art I'd like to see on the game, but sometimes it reaches the publisher. No, we decided we're going to completely change it, we're going to do a game about farming. And that may not have fit the idea that you had. So after all that I've said to you, what is, how much leeway does a designer have, and then how does the art kind of, for the consumer, ooh, I want to buy that. I know someone like myself, if something is culturally accurate in the game and it is about, and they did the research, I'm a teacher. I'm reading it, this is great, I really appreciate that you took that time to do that. So there's a lot of things that I'm asking you in this question, but basically coming down to art, how does it influence the buyer, how does it influence on maybe the publisher side, and what say does the designer have in that? And pick any part of that you'd like to talk about, but basically.
I think one also common common mistake that I see for game designers is that they get their own art, for a game that they're creating. So I wouldn't recommend it. You could do it if you want, but like it's probably not going to fit what the publisher is looking for, because it is very important to have, say, the art match that promise. Very, very important. If there is a disconnect there, like you kind of mentioned earlier, it's not going to be successful. So that's going to be a lot of money that you're spending on something that probably either won't be used or shouldn't be used, and maybe they will do it to save money, but it's probably not going to lead to a successful game as it could be if you did, and just leave that up to the publisher.
Yeah, I mean, art directing is its own whole skill set, and it is not one that I really have. There are other people in my team that do art direction for games where our studio does art direction. We typically, I would say about 60 to maybe like 80% of games that are signed from designers are probably published with the themes that they come in with. But it's a pretty solid, like about a fifth change themes or shift within the theme, the general theme that they're set in. So as a studio, we've been part of a lot of game rethemings, and some of it is just really quick. Who here in the audience is working on a game themselves? Is a designer or publisher or something along those lines. A lot of times, if you're working with a publisher on a game, it's not just that they are going to randomly retheme your game. It does happen sometimes, but usually as you're starting that relationship, they will let you know before you've ever signed the contract that they're intending to retheme the game. And so it's not an out of the blue change, it's often a conversation that's happening between you and your partner, and you're often brainstorming together, or they are going to propose some ideas. And yes, the publisher has the creative control, but you are picking who your partner is for publication, and so you're often going into that relationship with a strong sense of, I know what kinds of games this publisher makes, I know what kinds of art budgets they give. You can look at the production on their past games and say, like, hey, I think this is gonna be a good fit. And so when we do retheme, we haven't really had huge pushback from the designers on those rethemes, because it's a conversation that's happening with them. It's not us unilaterally making decisions where it like disappears and then comes out with a whole different theme. That does happen sometimes. It's not that never happens, but it's rare.
On the art direction front, just from a photographer's standpoint,
Right.
if you're designing a game and you're like, I want this game to have exclusively black and white components, that just makes photography really hard, so like, please don't do that. Basically, my thing. It's just, I work with black backgrounds or with white backgrounds. Trying to just figure out how to make that work has been the bane of my existence for at least 3 games I can think of offhand. So I'm just like, also think a little bit about like, when I'm marketing this, I guess to make it an actual statement, not just me whining. When I'm marketing this, there's going to be some product photography that takes place there. If you have components that are vulnerable to getting like blown out during product photography, try taking some pictures yourself of like the things that you're thinking about. Try like messing with some stuff. Get a sense of what it looks like and how you're thinking about like when it's going to get marketed as, and that may influence some stuff. It's just like visibility, but also if your game like. There are some games that there's a good art, there's a forgettable art, there's a bad art, and there's a meme level bad art. Like there are some games that if we were to rattle this off on a perhaps non-recorded version, I think we could all come up with a game that has art that is so bad that it is stuck out in our brains as memorable. That's not really what you want your game to be memorable for.
Right,
It's just
right.
like, yes, the art in insert theme here is deeply terrible. Like they never even watched the show back.
Sure.
Offhand.
Something about human teeth.
Yeah, when graphic design is super important to support and bring out the best in your art, and I will use an example here because I think it's this is not a me personal opinion. There's a Richard Garfield game called Carnival of Monsters. It's by Amigo, and they ran a Kickstarter for it, and it has a huge lineup of very well-known fantasy artists. A lot of people who illustrated for D&D source books, Magic the Gathering, Paizo, Pathfinder. But the graphic design they put onto the game muddies out the art that, like, from these really premium or like very expensive artists that they paid for, to the point where the game as a whole doesn't look good anymore. So it's not just about dedicating money to your artists and hiring, you know, the best artist or the artist who has the biggest brand name recognition. It's also about making sure that your game's component choices, size of cards, formatting, graphic design are supporting and bringing out the best in that work too.
And even thinking about how things are going to look when they're resized, how things are going to look when they're shrunk down. The really interesting thing is from like a reviewer standpoint, I think a lot about the tension between like iconography and text when we're talking about like cards, right? So like if you have some card and you're like, it's got this icon, which means draw 6 cards, discard 1, and this icon that says you can steal 2 cubes from your opponent, but only while they're not looking. I'd love to see what that art, like what the icon looks like. But it also makes it very difficult to, like, I tend to play games with new players because I also want to see, like, how does a new player respond to this type of game, this type of genre, and that influences how I think about it when I'm reviewing it. But when everything's on the card with text, it's easy to understand sometimes, given that you now have to interpret the text. Sometimes things aren't necessarily interpretable. When it's an icon, now you also are going to have that thing where you're consistently going back and forth the rule book. So how does the graphic design of your icons make your game easier to learn? Are the icons memorable? Do they stick in the player's brain? And does multiple repeat games of it actually cause you to remember what an icon is for the future? Because I have played some games that I've gone back to and I'll just like open the rule book, look at the icons, and then just have that nice little Gandalf game where I'm like, I have no memory of this place. Like other games, like, yeah, I can look at a game and be like, yes, this is draw 2 cards.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of them use similar iconography
Yeah.
universally.
I know exactly what all of the Uno cards do.
And if you are a designer and you're making prototypes of your own games and you're planning on licensing them to publishers, the publishers are going to hire a graphic designer to redo all your icons, your layouts, etc. However, the graphic designers they hire often are going to use whatever prototype you turn in as the core basis for what they do. And really good graphic designers are going to be able to transform even a terrible designer layout into something wonderful. But often, you don't know where it is in the project calendar. You might be just like the last thing they have to squeeze out at the end of the month as a graphic designer, even if they're good. So it is worth the time as a designer to look at the usability of your prototype icons and your prototype layouts. And I know that that's not always the core skill set of everyone who is a game designer. And it's worth, in my opinion, spending some time to learn some of those things and like go read some books about sort of like layout hierarchy, typography, learn some basics of graphic design and layout, because you don't want your game to come out and what the graphic designer did was copy your prototype and then it's bad.
Also, it's like,
And it happens all the time.
it's 2022. Upload some pictures of your components to a colorblind like check site. Make sure that it's visible for people with like different levels of color vision deficiency. Like, it's real easy. I do it for my reviews. I take a photo of the components. I check to see how it fares in different things, and I'll make a note of it. Like, that's something that should just be reflex.
I'd say like the most important thing for art, other than it grabbing people's attention, is letting it do the teaching for you. And that goes into the graphic design as well, because I'm a verbal processor. So like it helps me talk a lot less at the table and just like visualize a lot more if it's all kind of, again, the artwork isn't being muddied. Instead, like I can't think of any right now, but I love when games utilize the graphic design and the art to bring in your attention about what that area on the board does. Like the Garfield
Yurko
Okay.
the cat.
No, the games, the
He hates
Australian
bundles.
games with the architects and the kingdoms.
Oh, yes.
He hates normal.
But-
Monday's on.
Yeah, okay, like that one usually stands out to me because like it was laid out. I'm like, oh, I kind of get an idea of everything that's going on here because the art and the graphic design work together with the rule book to make it accessible for everybody, because you don't know. The other thing that you're going to handle, like when you're trying to get your game to other people and to get them interested, you don't know how they think. So making the art accessible for people who are visual learners, making it accessible for people who need like icons and tend to think more linearly along those lines. You're not going to have a perfect game that will fit for everyone, but I think the whole thing you can do that will really set you apart to like help you get your game out to people is making the art and the graphic design work with the rules to get people going, I can understand this.
Yeah, and that's why it is sometimes useful to put like temp or public domain art into prototypes when you're like doing your play testing. You know, let's say you have a game that's about building different outfits, right? And you have tops and bottoms and shoes and accessories, and you could just sort of like put your little icon in the corner that says this is a hat, and then you like give it a name. Then you have like a blank window, and then the text down at the bottom. You know, classic sort of card game layout. But it is useful to put a picture of a hat there, precisely because of that sort of visual recognition and identification. And so it is not strictly necessary, and maybe it's not worth doing for your first prototype or even maybe your third prototype, because it takes a lot of time to source images. But at some point in your prototype process, I do personally think it is worth putting temp art into prototypes, not necessarily paying and commissioning for art, but because you're not testing the ability of players to visually identify, and you'll actually see game speeds increase, right? Your playtime goes down when you make that step on your prototypes over time.
They'll focus more on the game and less on the things that are going to change anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
Give them a little help. And I think some of the things that have been discussed are things that most people won't notice. Specifically, they won't be able to call that out, but they're going to have a much better time playing the game because it was easier to learn, and things made sense, and it was looked pretty, and like all these things are just like, it gives me a good feeling playing that game, and then it's going to come off the shelf again and get played more, and more people are going to have fun playing with it and be like, yeah, I'm gonna buy that the next time I see it somewhere. So I think these are a lot of these things. Just they're important, but also hard to just kind of specifically most people won't notice.
Sure, absolutely. And then I know we touched on it a little bit here, but target audience, is that something that you need to, this is who I'm going to make this game for specifically, or are you trying to make it a bit more general for kind of anybody to play? And also talking about development of the game, things like that, because I'm looking at you, Eric, because we both make content. How many times have you played a game with a bad rule book? The game hasn't been tested enough, and you just go, I'm done. No, I'm serious. You're in such a bad mood at that point, you don't even want to look at
I
it.
did play a game once with I have a friend who's like one of my dedicated, like he'll play anything. We played a game, he looked at me and was like, I never want to play this again. I'm like,
And it's a great game.
it was not.
Okay.
Target audience is actually a really interesting thing because I had a very fascinating experience with founders of Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan?
Yep.
I bad at pronunciation. But yeah, Teotihuacan. There it is. Got there eventually. I think it's a good game. My review of it, or my score, was probably going to be a little bit lower than what I would expect, because what I think is it's a very good game for its target audience. Its target audience tends to be a gamer who plays average weight games that are slightly higher than mine. So it's someone who will sit down and say, this is the kind of game I would play after work. Whereas I'd sit down and I'm like, this is the kind of game that I don't know, I wouldn't play it after work because it's a little bit more tanky than I'm looking for, but it's, I don't want to play it as a game day, it's not quite heavy enough that it's a sit down all day thing. And there's some technical term wibble in that range, right? You've got your wibble, you've got your wobble. And I think that's interesting, and it may affect who you send it to as reviewers, because you kind of want a reviewer who's going to be in your target audience, right? You're not going to send heavy gamer for life. I assume that's a YouTuber. You're not going to send them Animal Upon Animal for Kids Junior. You might. I think that would be fun personally. I think from a content standpoint, it's always important for me to play a couple games every now and then that are outside of my main road, because it helps me, sort of to John's point earlier, it helps me get a better experience and a better language and a better conversation ability to talk about games that I am playing that are inside of my content, main pipeline, and explain to my viewers why that is, and also help them think maybe I should branch out and try some stuff. It's I played Oath, I played Burn Cycle, I played heavy stuff, I just don't talk about it that much.
Sure.
But I think that your sense of target audience is going to kind of evolve as you make more games, because you'll have a better sense of who you're roughly designing for. It's tough because now target audiences are also shifting, right? There is the I tend to call them the 500 plus BGG crowd, and there's also people who are just discovering that there is more than 20 board games during the pandemic, which is now a huge and evolving market of people who are now going to Target. They're buying a game off the shelf, and they're like, this says Jumanji on the cover, it's probably fun, and that's great too.
Right.
But it means that like those folks may have a very different experience with, say, game X or game Y. Like, I have not yet seen someone go to a Target and come out with like Gloomhaven and be like, this is my first board game. And they just be like, what?
And your last board game.
And you're like,
It might be. I was like, there's a lot to do in that box.
and that's where kind of mass market games, this is why I asked, are kind of geared to, I'll ask an example. How many people in here have played Monopoly? Right? How many people in here have played Too Many Bones? Do you know what I mean? So like that game is specifically, they may not intentionally say that, but it is kind of geared to a specific group versus Monopoly, it's a mass market game, it's kind of to all.
Right.
Does it necessarily make it a better game? No.
But for some people, it is very much their favorite game.
Sure.
You go to someone's house and you like diss Monopoly, they're going to
Oh no, that's true, that's very true.
I have a friend of, or the family members of a friend of mine that exclusively play Catan. All they do is play Catan. Catan's the only game for them. Catan is all that exists under the sun. You're just like,
Very
oh,
popular.
wild. I'd love to like sit down and talk with them about like why that is.
They're my favorite people to play Catan.
But
Those folks scare me because I'm bad at trading and they're just like, too weak, and I'm like, I don't want to get involved in whatever you have going on.
so how do you handle that? Someone's, oh, I did this game and it's specifically for this age group. Do you kind of now reevaluate and say, actually no, we can broaden that audience, or we should broaden that to a bigger audience? Is that something that happens? Or do you kind of just stay in that lane?
Development, like for us, I think of development as sort of all about audience, and design is not necessarily all about audience. And publishing, hopefully by the time you get to market, you have figured out the audience. But to me, that is really where development sits, is really refining the audience, because when you're designing, if you're intending to license to a publisher, you have an idea of who your audience is, at least I hope you do. But then when you actually sort of like marry that game to a publisher, that publisher has an audience, and now you're looking at sort of the bridge of those two, and then maybe their developer in-house, or maybe they're hiring someone like us, is going to look at that and say, well, like what's really the exact thing we can narrow in on? And it's not that you didn't think about your audience when you were designing a game, it's that because it's now has a path to market, we can look at the audience from a different perspective than the designer can before they sign the game. So we are often looking at things like the game is 2 to 4 players. Is this the right kind of game to add a solo mode to? Does adding a solo mode expand the audience or marketability of this game? Does adding a 5th player increase the number of people who want this game? Is adding, let's say adding a 5th player might add $5 to the cost, or maybe the 5th player experience is a little slow, even if it's functional. Is that the right experience to be delivering for this product? And then separately, also things like ages. Maybe we're looking at complexity. Are we gonna? I've had games where the game came in sort of at, I would say, like the lighter end of the hobby scale, but the publisher who signed it really hit the core hobby market, and they were like, hey, I think we need to push this further in complexity so there's more space for our audience to explore, which is a little odd, because if you think about the size of the audience, the lighter you go, generally the larger size audience you can potentially hit. So it is sometimes a little like paradoxical of like, we're going to increase sales of the game by narrowing the audience, but that is sometimes what you have to do, because linking back to like making that statement, right? If you can hit a narrow band of people really, really well, that might do better than hitting a broad band of people at a sort of an average level. And the hobby market is weird and is way smaller than you think it is. So the reverse is also sometimes true. Sometimes the game comes in and you're like, hey, actually, we just really need to make this game more approachable for a broader audience, because the majority of people who buy games are not on Board Game Geek. They are not coming to conventions like this. They probably are not like going to public meetups. They're not going to your local game store. The majority of people who buy games are playing games in their homes with their families, with their roommates, with their friends. and their game experience is entirely enclosed within their immediate social circle. And so the ability to reach those people and understand that audience of people who are buying and playing games, which is, again, the majority of people who buy games in America, is super important. And when you're looking at things like recruiting playtesters for feedback, one of the things that we do is we actually run paid ads to recruit playtesters because we can target demographics and have them fill out screener surveys. Because if you're running off your publisher's marketing list, or you're going to a convention like this, or a local game store, that's great. All those playtests is valuable, great feedback. But you're never going to get, like a 35 to 50-year-old couple whose favorite game is Monopoly and plays games once a month as a family at an event like this. And so if you are making a game that is targeting that kind of audience, you have to find a way to reach those kind of players and involve them in your feedback and testing process.
Two things. One of them was you're now making me rethink the two people that I'm targeting for my campaign for Northampton and Roll Right. But also, it is interesting to imagine though, like taking a single design and shopping it to make, and like having like 6 or 10 different hobby game publishers take that design through the development process and seeing what game comes out. Because I think in some ways you're going to see some similarities, but you are going to see different things happen for like let's say you manage to shop the same design to like I don't know, like Elf Creek and Haba, right? Haba is going to come up with a very different looking game than Elf Creek is going to.
Right, different audience at a time. Exactly. I just want to make sure we have time for questions. Does the panel go till what time?
It says 4:20, but we can do an hour.
No, it's totally fine. I mean, I have more questions if you all want to hear the answers.
I'm enjoying it. It's
Okay,
awesome.
perfect. No, I will leave time for questions. So, marketing. We touched on it earlier a little bit. So, I guess, how does one market the game? I mean, there's content creation. The publisher, are you doing, videos, or how do you get it out there and more people to play the game? How does that, how do you make it stand out?
There's so many ways to do it.
And I'm asking because you're all going to give a different perspective here, so.
I think from the indie creator publisher perspective, most important thing is to set a budget, and your budget should be, because it's there are so many places to spend your marketing dollars too that you're going to spend on this game, so you need to be very, very careful with them. And so you think about if you're going to run a Kickstarter campaign or a GameFound campaign, how much you think you're going to make. And then probably cut it in half, or maybe do 10% of what you actually think, and that's what you're actually going to make. We'll say cut it in half, and then take maybe 10 to 20% of that, and that should be that's a pretty good ballpark on what your marketing budget should be. So by the time you get to that, for a game it might be $10,000, maybe $1,000. If it's $1,000, you need to spend you be very careful with every one of those dollars. It's going to be for a video. You're probably going to be making your video yourself. So if that's how much if that's your budget, $1,000, you're making the video yourself. You might have to do the graphic design yourself. You might have to create the Kickstarter campaign page yourself. You might have to do a lot of it is going to be kind of homegrown. If you have $50,000 to work with, now you have a whole lot more you can do, and you can have a lot of help with it, and you can really create a much better product. But if you spend $50,000 and your campaign only makes $50,000, you're going to lose a lot of money on that game. So that's one lesson that I've learned over the years, is that it's very easy to spend money. You have to be really on marketing, because you want your game to be successful. You made this thing. You want it to be as successful as possible. So you just need to be careful about that. So budgeting is key.
Okay.
It is worth, as a designer, thinking about, again, like the audience of thinking about how your game can be marketed and who it is going to be marketed to, right? And when you go to whether you're self-publishing or you're pitching to publishers, if you can't explain what makes your game marketable to a publisher when you're pitching, they're not going to be able to explain what makes the game cool and awesome to a customer. So it is worth sort of thinking about that as a designer up front of the promise of the game and the marketability of the game, because eventually you could have made the greatest gameplay in the world, but if no one sees it, if there's not marketing, like marketing is not a dirty trick to convince people to buy your game. It's a necessary thing to share the amazing thing that you've made with people who are going to enjoy it. Because if no one sees it, no one gets to experience the cool thing you made.
To build on that, there's also, I mean, when we talk about like working with content folks, right? You have a finite budget. You do not just want to like ship out a palette of games to everybody. And this is also where we think a lot about audience. So there's a temptation, right? When you have a game you want to share with everybody, you're like, okay, I'm gonna find the 5 biggest YouTubers and all send a copy of my game to them. Well, if you pick the 5 biggest YouTubers, pretty much none of them are board game YouTubers because it's just how YouTube is. And that's something, right? But there's also a question of audience and visibility. So like, if you are, my favorite channel is Heavy Games for Life 420 or whatever, and again, assuming this is a real person.
Sounds like a dating website name, so I'm not really sure. I don't, okay,
Okay, I was like, what?
I don't know, sorry.
You guys have a different conversation about that. But if you're sending them a copy of, Baby's First Monopoly, also a real game, I assume, there's a question of what is, now they may like it. They may be like, Baby's First Monopoly is the greatest game I've ever played in my entire life. But also, who's their audience? Who are they speaking to? What's the demographics? And thinking about the demographics of their audience is also going to be something that's worth considering, because if their audience, like, let's say you know how to measure conversion rates off of a YouTube video, in which case, fantastic. But also, if they get like 1% of their audience converting, it may actually not be worth sending it to them. Maybe we're sending it to like a targeted website that's for people looking for games, like things to buy for their children, right? So you're talking about like, oh, now I'm not going with Heavy Games for Life 420, I'm reaching out to like Stay-at-Home Moms Reviews, which is a great place, and talking to them about like things that I'm looking for families. So thinking about the way that you market your game, there are very clear like sloppy marketing techniques, which is just the full blast mode. I've gotten a bunch of emails that are just like, greetings, Erk, and I'm like, didn't even spell my name right, thanks. I love your YouTube, and I'm like, I don't make YouTube, so that's also wrong. And they're like, would you like to review Borp Game? And I'm like, who's spelling this? And they're like, it's sloppy.
I told everyone about my email.
But like, it's sloppy, and it's that lack of professionalism makes content creators less likely to step up, because part of it's that like when we work with a publisher, we're working with a publisher to build a relationship. If you're not interested in putting the effort into building that relationship, that's fine. It just means that you shouldn't blast out to everybody. It is, to speak to Mandy's dating website example, just going out on the street and yelling, I would like to date anybody.
Sure, but that's
No anybody. And I would go on a date with literally anybody. I'm like, that's lovely. But also, it doesn't really make the person that you do sit down on a date with, you're sitting there like, honestly, I would have dated the first person who came in the door. They're like,
no, you're not feeling special.
yeah, they're like, I'm confused as to why you reached out to me specifically. And it's important to be intentional about this. Also to think about a representative sample as well, right? Because if you're trying to have a wide demographic and you're only getting one demographic when it comes to your reviewers, be that like the type of reviewer you go to, or like I only got video content creators, you're now missing out on a key audience sample that may be people who would actually like your game. So it's important that, like I said, be intentional. Think about the samples that you think about the representative population that you want, and work with content people to reach those people, because there's a group of folks that have essentially the same reach, because a lot of folks are appealing to the BGG 500 plus crowd. If you want to have a game that has a wide appeal, you also need to figure out ways to crack into the people who are not ranking every game to get on BGG or getting in fights in the comments or whatever you do on BGG. It's been a while.
And pay your content people. A lot of people in this world think things are free. They're not. If you want to establish that relationship, respect their time and what they do, pay your content creators.
Also, please don't assume that the photos on BGG are free.
That's exactly that. Be careful with things like that. Did you want to have anything?
I wouldn't say like, just remember like whoever you're marketing to, that entire community is not made of a monolith. Like if you want to communicate, if you want to sell your games to women, you're gonna have to get a lot more specific, because it's not like, You can go into a room of 50 people of one demographic or type, and you're going to get very different passions, very different ideas. You're going to get some shared perspectives, which are very important. Understand what those are, and celebrate that you are going to be able to give them something that will bring them joy, and they really want to be in on that. But just don't approach them all like, you like games, you have babies, you'll love Baby Monopoly.
It was really confusing because one of my favorite games growing up was Careers, and in 1992 they released a version called Careers for Girls, and it turns out that was actually not super.
Oh,
Yeah. And it's like, it's like some things like that are obvious, but it's just like if you like
This was the 90s. I was like, whoa.
like for me, I love Star Trek, right? And then
Are there other people who love Star Trek?
right? So like if I were making a game that I wanted to sell to data fans, I would be making a very different kind of marketing pitch if I wanted to make a game for Star Trek. Yeah, for people who love Kira or Jadzia Dax. Like it's know the community, but also know who makes that community, because they are going to be wildly different and fascinating and beautiful, and you get to tell them about something that you're making for them. There is no greater joy than that.
And I'd see your company making a data game, and my co-publisher would then produce a game that's all about lore and try to get customers to use it.
It's her expansion!
Market.
Alright, so I have one last question for you, and then you're going to kind of sum up something that maybe we haven't covered that you'd like to talk about, and then I'm going to leave some time for questions for all of you. So, my last question is kind of a weird one. What is the player fantasy? This feels very weird asking this question about dating.
This is a family convention.
Okay. But as in, like, what do you want the player to feel when they're playing this game?
Smart and successful.
Okay.
I think to build off of that, there's a big difference. There's a huge difference between me playing a game and going, I am very smart, and me playing a game and going, the designer is very smart. And it's like, both of those things are valid feelings, but I've definitely played like a couple games going, I get it, the designer is very smart. I am not, but the person who made this game is.
And that's very valid. I think I had a designer tell me once we played a game, and our scores were, I don't know, 40, 50, 60. And we had some concerns, and he's like, oh, we didn't play it right. Oh, I'm sorry. Was there any specific way that I'm supposed to play the specific game? And, you now limited yourself, like, oh, I guess there's only one way to win. Right? So, yeah, absolutely. I guess I wasn't as smart, so.
And I think most people you want the player to feel smart. You don't want to think that the designer is smart. Like there's maybe a very sliver of a population who will really respect that and like the game because of that. But yeah, that's actually really key that both of you hit on that. Just like make the player feel smart. Like that's really actually one of the most important things about a game.
While I love quoting that Ozymandias poem, you really are just trying to shoot for that. You're having like one player be like, "Look upon my works in despair." And like that's how I feel. I wanna have come to the end of the game, built something, and then there's another player who's looking at the stuff that I built and being like, despair. And that's like a great pipeline for me. Like,
and I think too with some games you don't really have to be good at it. How many games have you played that you're not so good at, but you're like, oh, but I just want to go again because I want to try a different strategy. That is a fantastic game.
Yeah,
I think.
A truly great game for me is a game that is very fun to lose. Like you come off of it and you're like, that was a fun experience, even though
Absolutely.
I did not know that a player could do as badly as I
Right?
did.
But you want to do it again.
Yeah, exactly. Like someone watching this would be like, wow, whatever child you beat did a really bad job. Oh no.
If you're making a 4-player board game and your game is only fun for the person who wins, congrats. Like you've just alienated 3/4 of the people who played your game for the first time. But yeah, for me, the fantasy thing is like different games can provide different kinds of fantasies and different kinds of fulfillment. And like as a developer, I work on very commercial products, and a lot of what the kinds of fantasies and fulfillment I get to provide is dictated based on what the publisher and what my client wants to do. As a designer, because I do also design games, I really look for ways to tell and provide new kinds of fulfillment or enjoyment that don't already exist. A broad category of games I would call power fantasies, right? Smart and Successful is a power fantasy of like
It's my big dream.
I am never going to build a castle in real life, but by playing this game, I can build a castle. I can be an adventurer. I can slay a dragon. I
Do my taxes.
Yeah.
Wow.
Complicated.
But I think too in a board game, if you can elicit these feelings, it's a lot harder because you play a video game. I play video games too. You're in that world that you can get involved in. If you can get them involved in a board game like that, I think that's a really powerful thing.
Yeah.
What you were saying.
Yeah, but yeah, not every game has to be that, right?
Sure.
Some games are they're satisfying because you're puzzling their way through, but they're not power fantasies. They're about satisfaction more than they're about power. I've been working on a couple romance games recently.
Shut the front door.
And like, there are kinds of stories that books and TV and movies and that exist in our world that games don't tell right now. And I think like as a designer, you should challenge yourself sometimes to figure out how to tell a kind of story that no one else is telling, or a perspective that you have on a kind of story that no one else has.
My ultimate power, like fantasy as a player, is that like we reach social emotional fulfillment and go, we lost, let's do it again.
Right. That's
I never refer to those as Rackham games, like, cause it's just like playing pool. You just like narrow your eyes, and like re-rack. Until I win. And I like games that you can just yell, "We're playing until I win."
Absolutely.
I think I play with a lot of new people that are like new to the hobby, and I think when I'm teaching games and introducing games to people who have not played that particular game before, I have to keep in mind that I'm teaching them a skill I already have. And that is something we really forget. It's not as simple as like reading the rules, as there's that video of Mandi Hutchinson and his family playing Wingspan.
Yeah.
For many of us, Wingspan's like, oh yeah, the art and the graphic design, they really reinforce the rules, they help you kind of understand the flow of the thing. But if you are, so again, I think my player fantasy tends to be people sit down and they're like, I can do this, because board games are so intimidating. Because we have so many other things that like give us that instant gratification where we could feel smart and successful without having to do much more than scroll through something. This is not like a dig on anyone in technology. That's just our world. So if at the table, like another game I really like is Gudetama. It's a simple trick-taking game. It's a cute naked egg that's lazy. It's awesome. But like it is one of those things where you forget who's winning. You're building a lot of board game skills and learning a lot of different mechanics of those. But everybody feels like they won, whether they won or not. And I think that is the ultimate experience.
Yep. And to give an anti-pattern to that is like there's sort of an anti-power fantasy where like players feel stupid and unsuccessful, and that will not only turn them off of your game, but will turn them off of games in general. Like as a quick like, how many people in the room have played like Azul? Say probably about like say more than that. So like for instance, I have a friend who basically refuses to play board games because she had a really bad time playing Azul. And when teaching Azul, she was like, I don't understand this, I don't know how to score, this is complicated. And so someone told her, oh, the scoring's really simple, it's just like Scrabble. Oh, she hadn't played Scrabble. And so you're like, oh, okay, well, and so we kind of forget for a second that a lot of us who are, again, in that like, the BGG 300 plus or 500 plus score, even just the convention attending crowd have been so steeped in a lot of the board gaming jargon that when we're talking to people who aren't as steeped in that, there are things where you're like, oh, well, this game is really simple. So it's a 5-minute variant on an engine building game where what you're doing is you're deck building through a roll and write, but your deck is actually the cards that you're pulling through a drafting mechanic to do some simultaneous action selection that'll ultimately lead to a multiplayer social deduction experience. And the person will just throw up like just out of sheer rage.
And this is where people are designing games, you need to have that, 2 to 3 sentences to explain what your game's about. Suzanne and I yesterday, like how many times have we gone up to someone, give us a really short snippet of what your game's about, it's 10 minutes later and we're still talking about it. You know what I mean? We're in a world now where people want instant, gratification, so you gotta make it short and hook them down.
Yeah.
Down the line, because I wanna give them some time for questions, just quick, anything you wanted to add, and then after we'll give everybody contact information if you feel the need to get that out.
Oh gosh, everyone's looking at me.
You're starting.
The defense rests. That's all I have.
I think most important is remember that you love other things too, and bring that into your passion and love for board games. And because like you're sharing joy, embrace that and talk to people about it. But you don't need to talk to them about like phase mechanics and things like that. You just talk about things you love and bring that in. I just couldn't get better. Love it.
Oh, that's
I can't follow that. No, I'm interested if there's more questions.
Sure.
Yeah, I guess like last thing is we talked a lot about sort of like art and some of like these theme and experience things, and really super thematic games are not the only ways to provide new and amazing experiences for people and challenge conventions and genres, and that is some of the things that I do. But like I think a great example of this is a game like The Mind, which is a very abstract game, but pushes
Oh,
and polarizing, but it pushes a lot of boundaries in play, and you know that is it really pushes the line of like what can a game be, what can a game experience be, and not everyone likes it. I personally do.
Little game.
But you know, I want to use that example of like you can, you know, while like you know, I think this panel maybe trends a little bit towards the theme-ier side. That is not the only way to innovate, and that's not the only way to push boundaries, and do cool, unique things. So, you know, I wanted to also sort of put that out there because we had so much focus on sort of some of the other parts of games.
There's a reason a lot of people like checkers and chess, right? Like, no one said checkers is dripping with theme. I wish people would stop using that phrase, but what can we do?
And to end it, be open to positive change. Sometimes people get really tied to an idea, the thought, and sometimes in your mind it's great, but it doesn't have the same feeling or vibe to everyone else. So just be open, and I say positive change because not all change is positive. Okay, so just be open to that. Do any of you want to just give some contact information in the event? You don't have to, but I don't know if that's something you'd like to do before I take some questions.
Sure, I'm happy to start off. So, quick re-intro. My name's Yurko. I do photography and reviewing for what'shartplaying.com, and I also sit on the board of the American Tabletop Awards. One place that you can find me is on Twitter. I'm what's-playing on Twitter due to character limits. Or if you have a question about board game stuff, I'm what'shartplaying@gmail.com. So happy to answer questions, especially about like media, interpersonal relationships, or just like I want to yell at someone about this game, and I'm like, yeah, I also like yelling at things, but like without caps.
I'm Monique. I love people, I love games, and I love talking about both. And you can find me on Twitter as Game Freak Geek, because though I do not like character, Twitter apparently does. So that's it, just Game Freak Geek.
What's there playing 16 characters?
Why would you limit this?
Again, Brian Henk, Pulled Up in Games. You can find us on any social media.
And John Brieger, you can find our team's website at briegercreative.com. And then for those of you who are local here in the Bay Area and are working on games, I run the Redwood City Playtesting Meetup, which is like maybe 15 minutes south of here. It's every other Sunday. If you don't have info on that and you want to find me after this, I will give you my card and I will send you. It's every 2 weeks. You can bring games that are in development and get feedback from other designers and players who come to the store.
Definitely do that. Yeah, I go to most of those also.
Great
group.
I just give them prototypes that I have.
Also useful.
Hey, to get to my house.
You want to get a hold of me, Mandi Hutchinson, at 613Mandy on Twitter and Instagram. And yes, 613 is my area code. All right, question time. Who has questions?
When you mentioned some of the games you play, you feel like the designer is smarter. Do you have any examples you can think of?
I think a lot about escape room games. So I think escape room games as a genre tend to have like good escape room games. You're like, yeah, this is amazing. I could have figured this out. Escape room games that maybe have a few more problems are like, yes, if only I had memorized the cities in Alaska by population. Like, I guess I would have. Like it's the shrug of, to not give any specific examples, which I know is a little helpful, but it's the shrug of going, I guess I could have figured that out if I had infinite time. But like, there's an incremental step there where like you learn like, I played a game called Heaven's Fault. It's a video game, but what you're doing is you're deciphering glyphs to like decode an alien language. The game does a very good job of introducing you to its language, not just the language that you're interpreting, but also how the game gets its messaging across. And then it helps steep you in it, and then give you some opportunities to practice it. It's an educational model, right? If you're given a test on something that you had no opportunity to learn, you probably won't pass it. But if then you're told, oh, you had no opportunity to learn this, but you should have already known it, then it's just going, okay, well, I guess the designer is smarter than me. That's nice. But like, I find that there are plenty of very good, difficult escape room board games. I think like Light in the Mist and Emerald Flame are very good examples. Yeah.
Did you get it?
Light in the Mist?
Yeah.
No, I previewed it. It's very good though.
I haven't played that.
Yeah, it's really good. But it's a game that is hard, but it does a good job of steeping you in how it chooses to explore puzzles. Have you played The Witness? It was a PC game. It made me hate puzzle games for a little while. That is a game that I was just like one of the puzzles, there's something that you can do to unlock. It's like a 2-hour video that you can watch of just like the designer talking about how he feels about puzzle games or something. It's been a while since I played it. That's a game that I'm like, okay, I guess this guy is smarter than I am. That's fine. Or like, if you ever want to play a really fascinating puzzle game, there's a game called Baba Is You for Switch, PC. That game is an incredible puzzle game because it teaches you its language very quickly. You could, for context, the game itself basically makes statements, and you can change the statements themselves to influence how the puzzles interact, to influence how you interact with puzzles, and to basically recode the game while you're playing it. It's fascinating. It is too hard for me, but that's fine. It's very much like, I'm sure if I punched at it enough times I could eventually figure it out, but I think that's a game that sits nicely in the middle of like, I still feel a little bit stupid when I play it, but it's not the designer is just flexing at me. There's a language here that if I put enough time and effort in, I could probably learn it. I'm just not as willing to do that.
Then you YouTube solution, you feel like an idiot.
Yeah, this is
I'll make the argument that it could probably benefit from a more robust hinting system so that you could help players who just aren't. I'm not that committed, frankly, is the short answer here. But like some of the other games, like the Exit series of games, I think does a nice job of putting you in like I can figure this out. I could solve this. I find that balance is challenging, but I'd say playing a lot of games in those departments can help you really learn very quickly what the difference is between those two.
Any more questions? Oh my goodness, did we do that good of a job?
I'll ask a question.
Okay, Scott.
I'm thinking, just even now going through the dealer hall, one thing that sometimes games will fail at is just, you see the cover, you're excited, you turn the box over, and you're looking at the picture of the game, and something doesn't translate, you're like, I'm now not as excited, and you put the game back. Like, how do you survive the back of the box test?
It's a monolith, right?
$5 bills just strapped to the back. They have to buy the game to get access to it.
I think one thing Andy said earlier was about well, I guess just that you need to kind of sell them on that idea, on what the game is gonna, I guess kind of back to the promise thing, and then also just. If you can kind of explain that, like you need to be able to explain that in like in two to three sentences, I think you said. Yeah. So like do that on the back of the box. Like if you can just have it very clear, the secret sauce of the game, the hook of the game, but also just kind of like how you play it. You do this and this and this, and whoever has the most of these wins, kind of. So you can just see and have it really pop too and show like the best parts of it, the best components, and just make it. You do, that is a really important point in, when someone is choosing whether or not they're going to buy, is whether they can turn it over, look at the back, and like, you got to sell them on that right there. So those are some things I think that I guess I've learned over the years. Helps.
Very much so, I agree. Anybody else have any questions? Now's the time. Okay, well, that's it. So thank you everybody so much. Thanks to the panelists for coming, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure.
And thanks to Manny for hosting.
Yeah.